Good afternoon. This afternoon, our panel will discuss the October 10th, 2019 directive from CMS that highly recommends the professional administration of Medicare Set Aside account where a claimant is taking controlled substances that are frequently abused. For those of you who are attorneys and adjusters paying attention to the specifics of this, you can find this in the guide at section 17.1. Few have commented on this guidance, and we believe it merits a thorough discussion, given the potential dangers posed by using certain drugs. We should tell you that all of us have read a report from the California Workers' Compensation Institute that deals with a very, very similar topic, but that report came out some 2 years before the guidance. Our program is scheduled for an hour. We have a chat feature built into the presentation, and the panel has agreed to entertain questions while on topic, and then we will entertain questions at the very end. So we'll speak for about 50 minutes. We'll entertain questions during the course of that 50 minutes, but at the very end, we'll leave 10 minutes for questions in general. As with other Ametros presentations, we are assisted today by Melanie Solomon and Melissa Wright. Let me introduce our panel. With us this afternoon, disguised as Billy Gibbons, the lead guitarist for ZZ Top, is Mark Pew. Mark is a senior vice president with Preferred Medical. He is a passionate educator and, interestingly, his material tells us that he's an agitator. Known as the RXProfessor, he is focused on the intersection of chronic pain and appropriate treatment, particularly as it relates to clinical and financial implications of opioids and benzodiazepines in other prescription pain medication. He is a vocal advocate for the bio, psycho, social, spiritual treatment model that focuses on the whole person. Mark has received the Work Comp Central's Magna Cum Laude Award in 2016 and the International Association of Industrial Accident Boards and Commissions Samuel Gompers Award in 2017. Last year, he was added to the advisory panels of Simple Therapy and the Harvard Med Tech. Mark, is there anything you'd like to add to this introduction?
I could go on forever, but I think that gives a pretty good highlight, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and Chris.
I was going to suggest that you could be in contention for a Guinness Book of World Records position, in that you've probably spoken at more workers' compensation conferences than any other person who's out on the circuit these days.
Well, I have done over 600 presentations to about 48,000 people in 41 states since 2012, but I don't really count that stuff, so that's just an approximation.
That's great. We are also joined by Chris Lagnese. Chris is a vice president of pharmacy and managed care at Ametros. He is a pharmacist with over 25 years of experience in pharmacy benefit administration and related services. His management and operational experience includes both large pharmacy chain providers as well as pharmacy benefit managers. Before joining Ametros, he served as a vice president of sales and services at Trieste and is a former director, PBA Pharmacy Products for Change Health. He is a member of the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy and the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs. At Ametros, he works to help our members identify areas where they can save more on their medical treatment and provide them with resources to help make more informed choices as they manage the complicated healthcare world post-settlement. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Chris?
Oh, thanks, Paul. I think you covered it well, and yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to continue this discussion with you and Mark today.
Thank you. I am your moderator. I am Paul Sighinolfi. I have no medical training or pharmacy training. I am a lawyer with years of trial experience, much of it focused on workers' compensation. I was appointed and served as the executive director and chairman of the Maine Workers' Compensation Board, a position that I held for 5 years. But I'm particularly interested in this topic. Let me tell you why. Prior to law school, I did graduate work in psychology and rehabilitation counseling. And during that graduate program, I had to serve in several internships, one of which was at a methadone maintenance program where I dealt with heroin addicts for a period of about a year. My job was to do the intake for all of those folks. And so I learned a great deal about addictive behavior and addictive personalities and what got people addicted in that project. I then was part of a special governmental program where they trained young professionals to solve the drug problem in the United States. I was one of those people. It was at a place called the DDI, the Drug Dependency Institute at Yale. It was a program that lasted for approximately a year, and it was something that ultimately prompted me to decide to go to law school. I am presently a managing director at Ametros. We are a company that does the professional management of Medicare Set Aside accounts, and Ametros has afforded me the opportunity to organize and moderate this program.
One of the things that really that prompted the conversation was this change that advocated for professional administration. You want to give some insight maybe to the audience in regards to where that came from and what you think the motivations are and where we might be going with it, and we can kind of embark upon that conversation.
Yeah, so as Paul mentioned, CMS updated their guidelines to recommend professional administration. And of course, with that is the inference, at least inference, that professional administration is going to involve an oversight for the management, or proper oversight of the management of opioids, and I'll call them frequently abused drugs, and we'll get to that, that CMS is determined to be frequently abused drugs, and that it'll be done consistent or similar to what that CMS has in the Part D programs. Interestingly enough, CMS just issued its recommendations for all of the Part D programs at the end of 2018 to be effective the beginning of 2019. And they have updates that happened in 2020. There weren't many updates, but some updates from CMS for Part D programs in 2020. So this became a continuum that CMS, as far as I'm concerned, did some of the first things with their Part D programs earlier in 2019, and it took X number of months, 10 months or so, for it to catch up to say, gee, in the case of Medicare Set Asides, we ought to be looking at those same guidelines that we put to the Part D programs earlier in the year.
What is CMS talking about when they're focused on controlled substances that are frequently abused? Mark, what do you think?
Yeah.
Well, the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970 by the President Nixon administration, and they created 5 different classifications. And Chris is a smart guy on this, so I'm going to set the stage for kind of the foundational, and then Chris, you can kind of fill in the gaps. But you know, those 5 different classifications, interestingly enough, the lower the number, the more prone for fraud and abuse and non-medical use. But as you look at the evolution of the Controlled Substances Act and how that kind of pigeonholes things that could be highly abused, it has become political, and actually it started political. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, which is the lowest number, but the highest potential for abuse of the drug, as well as no medical use. But that was purely a political decision, not really based on science or based on evidence, anything like that. A more recent example is tramadol. Tramadol was not scheduled at all until about 4 years ago, and then it became, I think, a Schedule 4 drug, and the label didn't change, the ingredients didn't change, the perception of it changed, that potentially it was a drug of abuse, or at least had withdrawal symptoms and other things that potentially create tolerance, dependence, or even addiction. And then even more recently, gabapentinoids, the pregabalin, the gabapentin, have been introduced and being scheduled drugs, you know, at the federal and the state level. The UK scheduled both of them. And a lot of that is because there is growing evidence that especially gabapentin is a drug of abuse on the streets. And I've, you know, my simple approach and look at it is, if you see a street value for a prescription drug, that means that there is beginning to be abuse associated with that. And so several states have added that from a schedule standpoint. So there's science behind the different schedule levels and the expectations of abuse and the medical application of the OxyContin in Schedule 2. But there's a lot of political decisions and political opinions that come into that. Chris, I'd love your input as an actual pharmacist as opposed to just some guy who has an opinion on what all that means.
Well, I think that, yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think that what's interesting is Paul phrased the question about what they had as the frequently abused drugs. Despite all of that, what you said, we know that occurs due to the DEA scheduling of the items, which is about their abuse potential and the continued movement of the abuse potential, as you stated. When CMS issued their guidelines for the Part D program, effective for 2019, they specifically said, and despite all those drugs and examples you gave, they specifically said frequently abused drugs for 2019 and again for 2020 shall be defined as opioids and benzodiazepines. So yes, there's other abuse potential items, as you said. It's a really great point, in terms of the gabapentinoids and such. However, the definition that they ran that at was opioids and benzodiazepines as they defined to be the frequently abused drugs to be dealt with. And I'll just go one step further. Paul, you may have a follow-up question, but just go one step further, is the fact that I found it interesting that the guidelines that they came up with were regarding opioids. There were no specific guidelines on the benzodiazepines, and in nowhere did they specifically say the concomitant use of benzodiazepines, even though we know, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's just that opioids and benzodiazepines with some specific minimum criteria relative to the opioids. So Paul, I think Mark is exactly right. All of those drugs are frequently abused drugs, but as it relates to CMS, they pretty narrowly just put it at opioids and benzos.
Well, Chris, what's an opioid?
I think an opioid is going to be really an opium-based. It's really important. It's opium-based. I think most of the folks we've seen so much about this. They're pain relievers. They're basically you work on neurotransmitters to basically relieve pain, and they have a lot of side effects, which is going to dovetail into the benzodiazepine concern. A lot of side effects that they could basically reduce the central nervous system. They can also have side effects for respiratory depression too, in terms of their related side effects.
And Mark, Chris was talking about benzodiazepines. What is I hear people talk about benzos. What is a benzodiazepine?
So you asked the non-pharmacist for that. It's an anti-anxiety, antidepressant drug, Xanax, Valium, variety of different drugs like that have been a part of the pop culture for a long time. If you remember the Rolling Stones song back in the 60s talking about Mother's Little Helper, that was Valium basically chased by a glass of wine, and they went back in the back room while their kids went crazy in the front room. So it's been around for a long time. The combination of Xanax and alcohol killed Heath Ledger, who was the Joker, along with Batman. So benzodiazepines have long been an epidemic from an overprescribing standpoint. And Chris, you can confirm or deny this, but I worked probably about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago at this point, with the PharmD to create a program called Taper RX, which was talking and walking through what an individualized tapering program should be. And as we were going through what drug classifications should be addressed and the sequence of them, she consistently said that benzodiazepine should be the very last drug classification that you attempt to wean, because it's so complicated, it's so complex, it's so highly addictive, so many different side effects. In fact, I think if you looked at it, I would think that the dangers of benzodiazepines are almost as dangerous as the opioids as well. And so when you combine a benzo and an opioid, and it's interesting, Chris, you mentioned that CMS really only talked about opioids, not even benzos. That's kind of where we've been at as an industry and as a society. We kind of latched onto this: opioids are bad, opioids are killing people, and I'm not discounting that whatsoever. It was a significant issue back in the mid-1990s and all that kind of stuff. But we've overlooked a lot of dangerous drugs that are oftentimes used. And when I first started getting engaged in looking and addressing inappropriate prescribing back in 2003, the thing that caught my attention was opioids. But every time I looked at an opioid that was being overprescribed, There were also benzodiazepines. There are also muscle relaxants like Soma. Soma itself is a very, very dangerous drug. There are all sorts of different drugs that address side effects like constipation and sleep disorders and not being able to wake up in the morning and increased anxiety and depression and lethargy and all those different things. So when I started looking at regimens that were overprescribed opioids, they were being prescribed all sorts of other drugs as well. And that's what drove a lot of the cost and the dangers to it. So, I think we've done our due diligence in understanding the dangers of opioids, and they are indeed dangerous. Although really the driver of the opioid epidemic now is the heroin, the fentanyl, the carfentanil, not the prescription opioids. But if you focus so highly and so solely on opioids, you can miss some other very dangerous drugs by themselves or in conjunction with opioids or in conjunction with alcohol that creates almost as many issues.
I remember years
I think
ago.
that there's certainly. Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead, Paul.
No, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think we've certainly seen statistics that the combined use of the opioids and benzodiazepines, it's something like they're used in combination in 30% of prescription-related opioid overdoses involve a benzodiazepine. And even though we see, from my perception, there's fairly low utilization, thank goodness, and I think we're going to talk about because of all the management programs that people are generally in to assist in that factor, but yet they make up such a large portion of the overdoses when they do occur, and assumedly in less managed situations.
Is there a synergistic effect of taking the two of them? Does 1 and 1 no longer equal 2, but it equals something greater than 2?
They potentiate. I think it's funny when you're reading the literature. It's less about a specific interaction that occurs, but there's a potentiation. They potentiate each other in the fact that they both can cause respiratory depression, and frankly, that's in a lot of the overdose deaths, it's due to respiratory depression. Essentially, it's lowering the heart rate and the lowering the respiratory response, which then ends up killing the person. So it's the two additively acting on each other.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, it's interesting when you look at people who have overdosed, you oftentimes hear from first responders or other people that they've turned purple. And basically it's asphyxiation, right? So that's what it does. So those two particular drugs, affect the central nervous system. They kind of turn off your autonomous system that remembers how to breathe and all that kind of stuff. And I think, Chris, you're absolutely right that that's what kills people. It's not the overdose of the drug itself. It's the fact that your body just kind of shuts down because you've been sedated almost to the point of your autonomous system not working properly.
Now that we've sort of laid some foundation here, I'm going to turn to you, Mark, because you're in a business that's able to give us this information. And I know from our discussions in preparation for this session that you have a great deal of information. Tell us about how much or what you're seeing in the use of opioids, and we'll talk about benzodiazepines after, about the use of opioids in the workers' compensation community as people are getting to the point where they're going to settle cases. And let me tell you what our experience has been at Ametros. Many of the cases that are settled are legacy cases. And what I mean by that is that they are people who have been in the system for something like 5 to 7 years. So they've had an injury, they have some type of chronic pain problem, they start using pharmaceuticals to deal with the chronic pain problem. What's the data show, Mark, on what kind of usage there is of these pharmaceuticals?
Well, the company I work for, Preferred Medical, is a pharmacy benefit manager, PBM, as well as an ancillary services provider. So we obviously have a lot of prescription drug transactional data. And so in preparation for this, I looked at 2019 data, and I looked at it by age group, but also by age of claim. And there were some interesting trends, and to make sure I get it right, I wrote everything down. So I looked at it basically from age from the date of injury of now to 1 year, 1 year and 1 day to 2 years, 2 years and 1 day to 3 years, all the way up to 5 years. And some of the trends I noticed in looking at that, again, 2019 data, it's a book of business, so it's not by patient, it's all the transactions that we process. that the use of NSAID decreased by more than 50% from year 1 to year 5.
Let me stop you there. We have a very mixed audience. What's an NSAID?
Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which are drugs that are really meant for use. And again, you're asking the non-pharmacist, but it's really drugs meant for use where there's inflammation initially during the acute and subacute phase to help dampen down that inflammation. There's a variety of different drugs. You can take too much of it. Acetaminophen is often buried not just in the name, but in the list of ingredients. So it's very easy to take too much of it. That's what NSAIDs are. They're really meant for that initial injury component. And if you've ever sprained your ankle or had, overuse by going out and hiking too far or whatever, you probably took an ibuprofen or something with acetaminophen, some kind of anti-inflammatory drug. Is that about right, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, that's ibuprofen is a typical one that most folks know about for anti-inflammatory plus pain relief, and I think just side effects of those typically can be gastric when there's too many of them. But yeah, I think that Mark, where you were going, and I'll let you come back to your stats, is the fact that it makes sense what you're saying, because oftentimes in the first parts of the therapy, and I think we're going to kind of get to a point here too, is the fact of realizing the trajectory of the person's care. And oftentimes in those first injuries, you have a lot of folks that have intensive care of some sort during the first part of their injury, and NSAIDs and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories makes sense that that's high early on for their reasonable moderate level pain.
Yeah, so in corresponding to that, opioids slightly increased from year 1 to year 5, but it wasn't a huge increase. And interestingly enough, from year 3 one day to 4, in that 3 to 4 year range, is when the cost of opioids finally exceeded NSAIDs. So there's a pivot point about that 3rd, 4th year where the trajectories cross. And I do a lot of business and have known a lot of people in California. In fact, I'm afraid they're going to start asking me to pay for personal income tax because I have spent so much time in California. But the CWCI said, I think it was last year when I attended their session or their convention, that NSAIDs had completely outstripped opioids in regards to both cost and utilization as the primary driver in California. So we have seen a switch, not just in the acute phase, not just during that first 1 or 2 years, but in general, even for legacy claims, where NSAIDs are being used more than opioids, which I think speaks a lot to prescribing patterns, speaks a lot to how patients are responding to opioids. There are a lot of people that are patients, i.e. injured workers and work comp, that know people that have overdosed or become addicted or dependent to opioids, whether it be prescription opioids from the doctor or then gravitating to buying them on the street, or heroin or fentanyl. And so they're going to doctor's office going, I'm not taking opioids whatsoever. What else have you got for me? So there's a lot of stuff going on. The DEA certainly has been looking over the shoulder prescribers, looking for high prescribers. So there's a lot of dynamics associated with that, as well as certainly in workers' compensation drug formularies at the state level that mandate basically that switch. So interestingly enough, non-benzodiazepine anticonvulsants, and I know where you're going, Paul, what is it? Increased 4-fold from year 1 to year 4 until 1 to year 5. And those are drugs that typically are oftentimes used for pain, but oftentimes used in conjunction with opioids, based on my past experience, to help opioids work better. And to understand that Paul's going to ask that question anyway, let's go ahead and toss it over to Chris. What is an anticonvulsant? So we make sure we get that out there.
Yeah, and anticonvulsants are typically seen used in for seizures, where they originally started to develop for seizures, but they've evolved into also being used for peripheral neuropathy. But then you can see some other uses where that kind of hits a middle ground, not seizures, but the use of peripheral neuropathy, pain, basically extremity pain, has some use. but while I got the mic for a minute, I do want to note and go back to something you said a few minutes ago, because there's a question in the chat about is acetaminophen an NSAID? And no, it's not. I think, Mark, you mentioned that, but you were with the ibuprofen. We're talking about the NSAIDs, but acetaminophen is not an NSAID, but like ibuprofen is. But nonetheless, I just want to clarify that question. And also, there's an earlier question there, and I want to say it, but I think we're going to get to it because I want to make certain that the audience knows when to address the questions. And earlier on, someone asked a little bit ago, I do have a question beyond just the statement. Are there changes in expectations for narcotic use in the value of future medical care? For instance, if we are moving away from narcotics, should the MSAs be valued so high? And if you don't mind, I would kind of talk about the trajectory. Paul and Mark are going to kind of take this from here, because I know we wanted to get here also. I know it's part of our agenda anyway. And I think one of the things that's interesting, I've kind of dovetailed these together. A lot of these studies, as Mark was going through, and Mark was mentioning, we saw a decreased use over time of simple, moderate pain like the NSAIDs. Things pretty steady in the opioids. Increases of these anticonvulsants that are, being used for peripheral neuropathy. But in this is a recognition of the fact that the trajectory of someone's therapy care changes, and it changes over time, and the ability to affect and modify that care is also directly related to where they're at within their therapy. And so I think about the study, and the thing I loved about some of the recent studies that were going on, and even the one out of California, which dealt with comparing the folks in MSAs, because it dealt with the folks that were long-term claimants. Paul, these days we're even seeing more like 7 to 10 years as their average, and the person's been in the system and being managed in the system from the original injury before we're seeing them join Ametros. And I think that, with that, it's this recognition of what changes over time. A lot of the studies that I've seen, including California, looked at those long-term claimants, but statistically they were dealt with the entire claim of that person from injury. And so I've seen some other reports from other PBMs talk about the prevalence of opioids over time, but it's looking at their entire string of time. So almost logically, they're going to have more likelihood of one opioid, once you get to be 10 years into this thing. And for us, it's a little bit different. For all of us in Medicare Set Asides and settlements, and what drives the Medicare Set Asides, it's different. Because the snapshot that we're dealing with is that, as they said in the California report, is that 2-year snapshot of what therapies were going on in the last 2 years of therapy. And so there may have been things that happened to them early on. There may be surgeries and such that happened early on within their treatments, which are now in some sort of other maintenance mode. And we're all faced with what treatments someone was dealing with in years 8, 9, and 10, or 8 and 9, or something like that. And then I think to the question that's asked there, what's that mean for the trajectory? And I would say this: I expect future MSAs, because we're in a trajectory with the reduction now and much less use today of opioids. These high-level numbers, these 80,000-foot numbers of opioids are going down. We all see this. We're all very happy about that. The opioids are going down. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see that yet in MSAs, number one, until several years from now, because unless the person has been successfully, the degree that the person can be successfully tightened off of the opioids during that time period. I believe, professional opinion, I think, there's different studies on it, whether or not that becomes increasingly difficult to have that reduction occur. And so much of our objectives during this, once we have them in post-settlement, is keeping them safe within their therapies that they and their doctors are utilizing. But just I'm guarded a bit on how that should affect the future medical, and arguably that could be said for a lot of the therapies that the folks are on the last few years of their coverage.
Let me, as the moderator, interject here. You guys have been great. So from the data that we have, it appears that a significant percentage, and I think it's 28.4% or something like that, of the people who settle their workers' compensation cases have an opioid or some other pharmacological aid in helping dealing with their the effects of their injury. We then have them go to their respective workers' compensation boards, whether they're in California or whether they're in New York or whether they're in Florida, and they look for a settlement. Okay, their case is ultimately settled. There's an MSA that was either reviewed in advance or not reviewed in advance, but part of that MSA gives them pharmaceuticals into the future. And at the time of settlement, what happens is all of the safety nets that existed during the course of their case, the 5 to 10 years that they've been involved in workers' compensation, is suddenly gone. Their attorney closes his file or her file once the case is settled. The nurse case manager steps back, the adjuster steps back, and suddenly we have a person with pharmacological needs and a pocket full of cash. Is this what CMS is concerned about? The person who is now on their own and is going to be confronted with dealing with their medication and their medical needs with no one to give them guidance and direction. Mark, what say you about that?
I think that really is spot on, and I think professional administration is so important because injured workers and their caregivers aren't capable of doing a lot of the stuff that had been done on their behalf prior to settlement. And so I think that actually is the source, the genesis of the CMS recommendation, is to provide some guidelines. Now, granted, they're not required or mandatory, but at least some guidelines on what to pay attention to. There's a lot of support, regardless of what you think about friction costs within workers' compensation, whether it be utilization review or independent medical examinations or prior authorization set up in the formulary, or state mandated work comp formularies, or all the different people that are involved, nurse case managers, field case managers, medical directors, all those different things. You alluded to, a lot to them, Paul. Whatever you think about that, they are there basically to help guide that. And I understand this is a glass half full kind of approach, but they're there to help guide that injured worker back to recovery, back to as full a function as possible, to focus on the science, to focus on evidence-based medicine, to say no when no is appropriate, when the request is actually inappropriate, to say yes when it is appropriate, to allow for continuity of care where there's no gap in care. The thing that always ticks me off is when someone gets that first 12 visits of physical therapy and they're making great progress, but that's all that was pre-approved. And then they want another 6 in order to finish things off. And so we send it to utilization review and they don't like the decision because it was no. We go back and forth, we fight over it. We moan and whine and complain about it, about paying for additional 6 PT visits, all while the injured worker's getting ticked off because they're not getting the care, all while the injured worker's deconditioning and losing everything that they won and gained during those initial 12 PT visits. So I understand the friction associated with those oversight and utilization tools can sometimes be problematic and maybe even counterintuitive. But at the top level, at the premise level, it really is trying to guide that injured worker to as back to function and hopefully back to work as quickly as possible, using the best possible appropriate treatment that's based on science, not anecdote. And so if you think of it in that glass half full kind of way, and the people at the TPA, at the insurance carrier, the self-insured employer, at the different service providers, et cetera, that they're all doing what they should do in order to help facilitate the best care for that injured worker. If all that goes away as soon as they sign on the dotted line and say, I'm settled, and now that person is on their own, they haven't been making those decisions. They don't know how to make those decisions. Paul, as you said, they got this huge batch of money. And oh, by the way, one of the concerns potentially is they blow it on non-medical, and that's probably another part of what CMS is going, is like, we don't want this to come back to us boomerang, where you spent all your money on buying boats and houses rather than saving up for that knee replacement you're going to need in 7 years, or to pay for the monthly drug regimen. So you got all that stuff going on, and so that injured worker, sometimes they may be highly educated, they may have a PhD, they may have a PharmD, they may have a JD after their name, or they may just have a GED and just basically got through high school by the skin of their teeth. Either way, they're probably not clinicians, and they probably don't understand all that kind of stuff. So that's a long-winded answer to a fairly short question, but I think, you know, bottom line is, I think when that stuff drops off a cliff and says, you're settled, you're done, see ya, that can be really set that injured worker up for poor choices and inappropriate choices, or maybe the continuation of care, to Chris's point, that has really outlived its usefulness, and they really need to start talking and thinking about alternatives to that.
Hey,
I can
Paul,
tell
I
you
address
that.
it too. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, go ahead. No, I'm
Yeah,
just the
because I want to
moderator
kind
here.
of, you're thinking about the CMS's motivation for doing it. I want to dovetail that into a question that's out there too, because we think about CMS's motive, we kind of reflect or look at what CMS's motivation are, you know, regarding this. And there's a question that's a really good question. If the CMS determination contains opioids and frequently abused drugs that the treater continues to prescribe, but they would not be paid by a Part D plan because the opioids are excessive, how do you handle this? A really important thing to bring forward is on Part D plans and how CMS thinks about stuff. And by the way, it's interesting for me because I've seen a lot of how CMS.
Chris,
Yeah.
let me stop you there. We've got a lot of people in the audience who are very familiar with what Part D plan is. What is a Part D plan?
Part D is basically Medicare's coverage of the drug benefit.
Thank you.
Medicare specific drug coverage by the drug benefit. It's administered by various PBMs and health plans that compete for the individuals. As I say, they compete. CMS is also very concerned with their bennies, their beneficiaries. So much of us are in the work comp land, and in the CMS workers comp, in Medicare, CMS's interests are really heavily aligned to protecting the beneficiary, making the beneficiary is not just mishandled by those bad health plans. I'll just say it that way. So a lot of the audits are around that, how you market to them, et cetera, et cetera. So when CMS issued the guidelines for 2019 for the Part D guidelines, to get to this question this person put out here, which I'm really glad they did, the objective that they placed when they said the guidelines, they addressed really two main areas. One is opioid naive patients that hadn't had an opioid in a while, and limit to 7 days. I say in a while because they had recommendations, but basically there's a number of Part D plans that said in a while means 120 days, 150 days, 180 days. They all took their interpretations of it. But the other really important thing that the CMS said about the opioid program and their guidelines is it was really all about coordinated care. That where there's high doses of opioids, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I think, and multiple prescribers and or multiple doctors, that there's coordination amongst those providers. To answer this person's question, they went out of their way in those guidelines and even in their presentations, and they did sometimes in all bold capital letters to say, this is not meant to limit the benefit. And so nowhere do you see CMS excluding something that's excessive. All they're really saying to the plans is you better have those doctors talking to each other, and you have a right, if you want to put that person into, and we see these in some workers' comp states too, and some programs people run with physician lock-ins in or pharmacy lock-ins, et cetera. But in Part D programs, you could do this because of your program that you create for your opioid management, your drug management program, your DMP. But when you do that, all the protections for the beneficiary, you have to give them fair warning first, all the letters to them, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff to protect the beneficiary and not limit their benefits. So the answer to the question here, there are no restrictions of coverage of opioid by Medicare.
And I think that's really interesting, Chris, because you talked about limiting benefits, but there really wasn't any discussion about patient safety, which is the other side of the coin, right? You want to make sure they get everything that they are due, but what if what they're due isn't appropriate? And I've always found it interesting. The Department of Health and Human Services owns a variety of different organizations. CMS is one of the organizations that lives within that umbrella, but also the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, Indian Health Services, the National Institutes of Health, and SAMHSA. So if you think about all those different other organizations, other than maybe the Indian Health Service, all the rest of them are really based on patient safety, on drugs of abuse. Certainly that's where SAMHSA is. And in fact, substance abuse, abuse is the A part of that. Certainly CDC created their opioid guidelines back in 2016. So CMS is a little bit late to the party as compared to their colleagues under the Department of Health and Human Services. They should all have been sharing information and using the same roadmap, but they've all come to the same conclusion that these drugs of potential abuse are dangerous, and we need to put some guidelines or some guardrails around that.
Well, the submit or not submit argument always is, do I submit to CMS, have them review what the future plan is, or do I not submit and simply go with evidence-based medicine approach? What I always thought was interesting in that process is that it appears the CMS review is primarily financial. It is not clinical. It is not a review based on whether somebody is capable of living within this guideline. Chris, what is our experience? We have a snapshot that people are coming to us using pharmaceuticals. They're using opioids. They're using benzodiazepines. They're using acetaminophen and things like that. They come to us, and what do we see happen?
Yeah, we typically see we see a continuation of care. We see changes in care. We see just different time that we have them, where they're adding certain drugs. We're seeing certain drugs drop off. That just happens with any therapy. So we do see that change. I do want to kind of come back to something you said about the safety. Started the question, CMS, why were they doing it? I would kind of the other side of that coin is it wasn't for financial for this purpose, for the Part D programs for saying this. It would have only been in my estimation for the safety of those patients to have professional administration so that they do get the safety that's within that. And it's not financial because not as though we're reducing care or reducing coverage. It's not due to CMS trying to reduce the finances on it, albeit to Mark's really important point, it's a little bit disjointed. It feels a little late, feels still a little bit light in what they're doing, but I think it is still for any of those moves they made last October, I would believe is for their safety. It's a move in the right direction for patient safety.
Chris, let me ask you this question, and those of us who lived in a society and paid attention to people using opioids for years are sensitive to the fact that naloxone is out there, Narcan is out there. I think that's essentially the same drug, and it's the pharmaceutical that people use to bring people back from overdoses. The MSAs that we see, how many of them have something like that in the plan?
Yeah, Paul, and I'm going to answer the question a little bit of a different way because I try not to rely on what's evidence within the MSAs or within the documents that we get. There's a lot of times that we get incomplete documents in terms of all those coverage points. And so what I'm going to do is reflect on what we see in utilization, right? Because it may not have been in the initial MSA, but we're finding utilization of it, right? So we whether or not it was evidence in the MSA or not, we have, and I think that as some of you know, as we've been talking, for me, denominators are incredibly important whenever we're talking about statistics. And so thinking about of the opioid users, if we think about this year so far, for instance, of anyone who's had at least one opioid. So before we get into any other measures of those folks, so it's not all the folks we see in prescriptions, but anyone who's had an opioid. If we think about that universe of folks, we see that like 3% of them have also had a prescription for Narcan, for the nasal naloxone. It's something that I really feel something that folks, especially certain levels in their physicians, should be talking to physicians as having ready, that their caregivers know how to use it. The manufacturer of Narcan Emergence has a lot of good information about helping it. Just a couple more notes about that. I mean, it is so prevalently available. In 49 states, there's a standing order that a pharmacist can a standing order for Narcan to be given. And so I think that you have a lot of the states and a lot of the general programs out there supportive of making certain it's availability. I think our role becomes in making certain it's not overutilized, right? That you're not seeing too much of it being used. But I think it's a incredibly important safety tool for anyone who's in high doses of opioids to have available for them, their caregivers, to know how to use it.
Let me ask you this question, Chris, and I'll get to you in a second, Mark. I, as an attorney in this industry for years, I did a fair amount of defense work, and one of the questions that would always come up with clients when we were talking about settling cases and trying to figure out the value of settlement is, what do you think the pharmaceutical use is going to be of this claimant once we settle the case? Are they going to stop using everything and simply pocket the cash that's given to them, whether it's intended to be in an MSA or whether it's simply intended for future medical use? Do we see in the cases that we have any number of people who there's a dramatic drop off in their use of pharmaceuticals once their cases have settled, once we have their cases?
It varies. I'm going to give you a soft answer. Sorry, Paul. I mean, it certainly varies. I think I'm trying to get my denominator right, because we have a number of folks that have certain drugs that we just do see changes in treatments, or we may not see them. They maybe continue to treat, but we're not seeing them utilizing their funds for it. A number of things could be going on there that we're trying to help to keep them compliant. So I want to make certain I've got a clear number on that. But what we do see and we do know is that there are changes in treatments, and some of those treatments, which are interesting to see, you've got Medicare assisted treatments, right, for opioids, and we're going to talk about the fact that there are people, we're finding the people getting into that where they're at within their therapies, they've got ongoing treatments. It's a opioid use disorder. It's a clinical condition that they're in at that point. And we do see people start to taper off their opioids, but the same token, we may see them used more for Medicare medical assisted treatments. So buprenorphine, et cetera. We might see some of that being used as the folks are trying to work and get off it and tapering off. We've seen all kinds of different variances in how things change once they come on board with us.
So, Mark, do you want to weigh in on that? What's your impression of what happens when people settle? Are there people who simply pocket all the cash and stop using all the pharmaceuticals that they were using before?
Well, I've certainly heard of money being curative, and that may be as much a slogan uttered by attorneys as actual reality. I don't know if it's an urban legend or not, but I've heard a number of attorneys talking about that they had set aside money, that they had cut a check, they had done the MSA, which, by the way, MSA is a tremendously oversimplified approach to setting aside money. Nobody has the same regimen for the next 36.7 years. Everybody gets worse over time. Their condition changes, their comorbidities change. There's so many different variables there that this snapshot in time of the last 2 years of drug regimen, and just multiply that times the rated life expectancy, get the number, to get the dollar to set aside, is really, really oversimplified. So don't take into account, and I think, Chris, you talked about this, there's not a lot of clinical rigor associated with an MSA per se, because it's so tightly regulated by CMS, and so many different things that have to go into that. So I don't think we should ever look at an MSA as the treatment roadmap for the next 36.7 years. It's purely just setting aside money that we think will be needed during that time period. So I don't think anybody should ever look at an MSA as this is what the treatment plan is going to be for the next, rated life expectancy. But I think, certainly when you're talking about, getting money, certainly there are drugs that don't have any kind of withdrawal symptoms that you can discontinue relatively easily, or the withdrawal symptoms are to a point where someone who's got kind of that rub some dirt on it resilience, that they can just kind of fight through it and do that withdrawal process themselves rather than using medication-assisted treatment or functional restoration programming or anything like that. And they just decide, you know, I can do it without. One of the things that I have certainly read a lot about is that when you get that set aside, that people gravitate towards medical marijuana. Not that necessarily they can pay for that with their money that comes from that, but it may be cheaper ultimately overall, and they would rather pocket the cash in there. So there's a lot of dynamics associated with that. You know, the MSA is not the treatment regimen. It doesn't have the clinical rigor that says this is how you should be treated for the rest of your life. And there's a lot of different things that go into play as to their condition gets better. Maybe they move on. Maybe they were a captive of the system of work comp. And when they were in the system, I'm firmly of the belief that the sooner we can get people out of workers' compensation, the better. Not claims adjusters and nurses, but the actual injured workers themselves, because the longer you're inside the system, the more you become a victim of the system and the more you become somewhat codependent on the system. And so the sooner that you can get out of the system and get on with your life, the better. So sometimes people do that and go, you know what, now I got my life back and I can go, you know, I can help out Salvation Army, or I can get a different kind of job, or I can just retire on the beach, or, you know, what are the different things? So there's so many dynamics there that I don't think we could draw any specific conclusion, but I would say that whatever you sign off on the MSA probably is not going to mirror what actually happens once the settlement occurs and they disengage from the work comp system.
Yeah, one observation I want to make. Let me make my observation, Kristen, and the floor is yours. And the observation is, I never realized this until I started working for Ametros and saw professional management. We have cases come to us that have been in the system that are defined as legacy cases. Somebody has been in the system for 5 or 10 years, and then they transition when they settle their case to professional management. We then have them for the rest of their lives. We have them, you said rated age. Somebody's rated age might be 20 years, but we have some that without a rated age, they may live another 30 or 40 years. So they're essentially, the insurance carrier has them for 5 or 10, but we conceivably have them for the next 20 or 40. Chris, you were about to say?
Yeah, actually, I've got a couple questions here, but I'm going to stick with the one I saw a little bit ago. I'm going to dovetail into what both of you were saying. There was a question a little while ago about, does your PROAD agreement essentially require the claimant to agree with coordination of care? And I honestly am not tremendously familiar with that agreement, but I'm just going to speak to, so we may have to adjust this, but my understanding of whether or not it's specifically in the agreement. You know, both of you spoke to the fact that the person's been in the system for a long time and has been a part of some sort of programs along the way. So it's extremely likely that our members, especially if they've been a part of, we have a lot of good carriers that we're getting, and, you know, and folks that we get our cases from, and they're payers that have got some PBMs that are managing them. So typically coordination of care is not necessarily new to our members that it's happening unless they've changed their treatments, but it's not necessarily new. However, I will say this, we do take an approach when we're going to conduct, there's a lot of coordination of care that's just simple real-time messaging with the pharmacies, just to let them know, you know, your coordination of the pharmacy, hey, pharmacy A, did you know the pharmacy B filled the benzodiazepine? And then we can have outreach, that's going to happen real-time. But when there's outreach to the physicians over something, we do engage the member first to make them aware. And some of that really, it goes along with what CMS wanted. CMS wants the folks to be made aware. There's an opportunity for a conversation for that member before we actually go to the member. So they're made aware of coordination of care when it's going to occur, whether it's specifically, explicitly agreed to in the agreement or not. And we work with our members to make certain they understand why we're doing it. And really that it's just aligned to their interest. And we're there to, you know, there to take care of them.
To pick up on your point, I think it's important for people to know that the professional manager does what the settlement agreements essentially tell us to do. So if the parties have agreed to a particular program, they've agreed to handling things in a particular way, and that's ultimately reduced to an order, that's what we comply with. But we're not bound by some state guidelines on utilization review or things like that. They're not things that we deal with. Why don't we deal with another question, Chris? You have another question there?
It sounds like the abuse of prescription opioids is waning over the last several years. Is that correct? And it's an absolute yes overall. I mean, there's I'm trying to find a study, and we can kind of get you a study to get to, but I look at a lot of stuff that Doug Long produces out of what used to be called IMS Health. It's IQVIA. He's got a lot of statistics out. Overall, it's being reduced. And I really think a lot of it's being reduced for a number of reasons. What the states are doing, all these limitations to the limitations of 7-day supplies, even not just in the workers' comp system. It's great what the state bureaus have been doing for that, but just generally we're seeing a lot of activity, and most of that activity is to stop the claimant early, stop the injured person early. You know, so less of those numbers. I'm not really certain. There's not. In fact, I asked Doug this question. There's not a lot of good data that says those folks that have been on the opioids, how they're declining. Just in general, there's a decline. I believe that the vast majority of that is due to early changes in therapies to not get them hooked on the opioids early.
And there's been some terrific physician education, primarily
for sure.
the primary care physicians who are really on the front line, or the occupational docs. They're the ones that deal most directly and typically don't have all the tools in the toolbox that a specialist might have. Mark, you want to comment on that question? Is there a drop off, you think?
I would completely agree with Chris, but I think it's important to distinguish between abuse and overuse. My personal opinion, again, this is just my opinion, but I think the vast majority of people that are using high dosages of opioids and work comp, even in the past, have not been addicted to it, aren't necessarily abusing them. They've just been given a whole bunch of them, and they're taking them just like the doctor said. So I want to just make sure that we properly distinguish between abuse, which means that you are hoarding them, you're reselling them, you're giving them out to friends and family, those kind of things. That kind of abuse oftentimes turns into illicit opioids, which is the driver of the opioid epidemic. Now, the fentanyl is really the primary driver of the opioid epidemic, not prescription opioids, either prescribed by doctors or procured on the street. So I think it's really important, and I think in both of those cases, we're seeing a decline in both the abuse and the overuse of opioids. Unfortunately, though, with coronavirus, we're seeing an uptick. We had done really a pretty good job over the past 2 or 3 years in flattening the curve, to misuse a term that we hear on a daily basis now. And the trajectory was down on that. But with the isolation that's happening with coronavirus, the shelter in place, the mental health issues, anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs are through the roof in use, given over the past 5 months. Alcohol use is up by 500% during this coronavirus. And we're also seeing an increase in opioid overdoses. So unfortunately, we had seen a trajectory down in opioid abuse, whether it be prescription or illicit drug. But unfortunately, coronavirus, because of all the implications of it, we're starting to see an uptick, an increase in overdoses, an increase in fatalities. And who knows where that's going to go. I mean, we don't even know when we're going to be let out of captivity, much less when we're going to be able to get our mindset and get our mental health right, and be able to go out to movies and all that kind of stuff. 2020 has been really a tough year. So I think it's important to take that into account, because contextually, I think we're probably going to see, when we look back at the data, which unfortunately is always like a year and a half behind, so we won't see 2019 data until 2021. But I have a feeling that we're going to see it having gone down and then unfortunately start to go back up again, primarily because of the impact of coronavirus.
We got a very, very short period of time left, probably a minute. Chris, I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you, Mark, if there was one thought you would want to leave with our audience, what would you hope to have them learn from this webinar? You got 30 seconds,
my
friend.
I'll sneak two. One is the fact that we have a unique population that's within a certain point of their length in their therapy, and that is unique conditions. But more importantly, the fact that these folks have been in a system in which they've been oversight from either workers' comp bureaus and or especially the PBMs that their carriers have been involved with to help them stay safe and coordinate care programs. And one of the things we find important is once they settle, to have a continuance or have a program, have some continued safety net. Our goal is to try to help to keep them safe and help to keep coordination of care with their providers proper.
Thank you, sir. What about you there, Mr. Pew?
Well, I think drugs are appropriate for some people, but I would make the argument that non-pharmacological treatment, the biopsychosocial spiritual treatment, the concept of self-efficacy, the concept of locus control, the concept of doing what you can in order to manage this with a mind over matter and with a resilience and with a psychological flexibility, that's a better long-term approach, whether you're in workers' compensation or you have settled out of work comp and now it's your own dime.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. I've been honored to be with you on this webinar. I think that the folks who've been with us for the past hour hopefully have learned some things about pharmaceuticals, about drugs, and about what professional management can do to help people protect them going forward. And I want to thank you, and that will be the end of our program. Thank you very much. Stay well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.